Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. The Republican Party isn't just broken, it's morally bankrupt. And one of the clearest tells isn't found in policy platforms or campaign ads. It's in how the party treats its own. Because if you want to understand what a political party actually values, don't listen to what it says. Watch what it rewards. Watch who it protects. Watch who it discards. And right now, the contrast couldn't be clearer. Start with two names most people outside political circles may not recognize. Graham Plattner in Maine and Ken Paxton in Texas. Plattner was pushed out of his Senate race by Democrats amid allegations of sexual impropriety. Before him, Eric Swalwell was pushed out of the California gubernatorial race for the same offense. The decisions were made quickly, decisively, and without mercy. Now look at Ken Paxton. Paxton has been under indictment for felony securities fraud for years in Texas. He was impeached by his own party in the Texas House over allegations that he abused his office to benefit a political donor. He's faced whistleblower accusations, FBI scrutiny, and a steady stream of reporting suggesting a pattern of corruption that would have ended most political careers a decade ago. And yet he's not being pushed out. He's being elevated. He's running for the U.S. Senate. And not only has there been no serious effort to replace him, he's treated as a star, a fighter, a symbol of resistance. That contrast is not a fluke. It's not a quirk of Maine versus Texas. It's not about local political culture. It's about a moral framework, or more precisely, the absence of one. Because what you're seeing is a party that punishes weakness and rewards utility. A party that applies ethical standards selectively, not consistently. A party that has turned corruption from liability into a credential. And Paxton is not an outlier. He's the model. Think about what his record represents. Years under indictment, a formal impeachment, accusations of using the Attorney General's office as a personal tool to serve a wealthy ally. This isn't rumor or partisan spin. These are documented, investigated, litigated issues. In any functioning political system, that would be disqualifying. In today's Republican Party, it's almost a resume enhancer, because it signals something more important than integrity. It signals a willingness to fight, to break norms, to ignore constraints, to treat the law not as a boundary, but as an obstacle. And once that becomes the standard, everything else follows. You can see it at the very top. Donald Trump didn't just bend ethical norms, he obliterated them. A record of fraud, obstruction, and documented dishonesty that is staggering in both scale and frequency. Civil findings of sexual abuse, attempts to overturn a lawful election, open contempt for courts, for oversight, for any institution that refuses to serve him personally. And what was the Republican Party's response? Not rejection, not even hesitation. They elevated him. Twice. They reshaped the party around him, purged dissenters, rewrote their platform to align with his grievances and his narratives. And in doing so, they sent a very clear message. Character does not matter. Truth does not matter. The Constitution does not matter. Loyalty does. Once you accept that premise, figures like Matt Gaetz, Jim Jordan, and Elise Stefanik aren't anomalies. They're inevitable. Gaetz faced investigations and ethics complaints that in a different era would have ended his career. Instead, he was a conservative celebrity. Jordan defied subpoenas and played a visible role in efforts to overturn an election. He's rewarded with leadership positions. Stefanik transformed herself from a conventional institutional Republican into a vocal defender of election denialism and climbed the leadership ladder as a result. This is not a party struggling to enforce standards. It's a party that has redefined what the standards are. And nowhere is that clearer than in Texas, because Paxton doesn't exist in isolation. He's part of a broader ecosystem. Governor Greg Abbott presides over aggressively gerrymandered districts that entrench power regardless of voter shifts. Policies at the border are framed less as governance and more as political theater. Cruelty deployed as messaging, and within the state legislature you see the same pattern of selective morality. Republicans impeach Paxton when it suits internal power struggles, then pivot to rehabilitating him when he becomes politically useful again. There is no consistent principle at work. There is only calculation. At the national level, the pattern repeats. Mitch McConnell's refusal to hold hearings for a Supreme Court nominee in an election year, followed by a rapid confirmation under the same circumstances when it benefited his party. It wasn't just hardball politics. It was a declaration that rules are flexible when power is at stake. Lindsey Graham's transformation from calling Trump a race-baiting xenophobic bigot to becoming one of his most reliable defenders wasn't just political hypocrisy. It's emblematic of a broader shift. When faced with clear abuses of power, the party's instinct is not to confront them, but to minimize them, to excuse them, to redirect attention. And over time, that instinct calcifies into doctrine. What ties all of this together is a simple but uncomfortable truth. The Republican Party no longer even pretends to care about public ethics as a governing principle. Ethics have become instrumental, a tool to be deployed against opponents or inconvenient figures within the party, but never a binding standard. If you are useful, if you can raise money, energize the base, dominate media cycles, or deliver electoral wins, you are protected. If you are not, you are expendable. And your scandal, no matter how minor, can suddenly become disqualifying. That's why the comparison between someone like Plattner and someone like Paxton matters. It's not about defending one or condemning the other in isolation. It's about understanding the asymmetry. One party, for all its internal disagreements and inconsistencies, still demonstrates a willingness, sometimes excessive, sometimes flawed, to enforce consequences for misconduct. The other has largely abandoned that project altogether. Some political parties lose their way gradually, through compromise, through drift, through the slow erosion of norms. This is something different. This is a party that has made a conscious choice, a choice to align itself with figures who test, break, and exploit the rules, a choice to treat ethical breaches not as disqualifications, but as proof of commitment, a choice to weaponize standards selectively rather than uphold them universally. And that choice has consequences that extend far beyond any single election. Because democracy depends upon something deeper than laws and institutions. It depends on shared expectation, on the idea that certain lines should not be crossed, even when crossing them might be advantageous. It depends on parties that are capable of policing their own. When that capacity disappears, the system doesn't immediately collapse. It degrades, slowly at first, then all at once. And that brings us back to Texas, because the most unsettling question here isn't just about Ken Paxton. It's about what it means that someone with this record can remain politically viable, competitive even against an opponent like State Senator James Tallarico, who by any conventional standard represents the kind of scandal-free public servant voters claim to want. What it does say about a political culture when those two candidates can be locked in a dead heat. What does it say about the electorate? Because at a certain point, you can't explain this purely through partisanship or media ecosystems or campaign strategy. Those factors matter. They shape perceptions. They influence outcomes. But they don't fully account for what we're seeing. The blunt reality is that a significant portion of the American electorate is not just tolerating figures like Paxton. They are actively choosing them. And that choice carries implications that go well beyond domestic politics. It affects how allies perceive the United States, how much they trust its commitment, how seriously they take its rhetoric about the rule of law and democratic values. Even if the specific individuals, Trump, Paxton, others, eventually leave the stage, the conditions that elevate them remain, the voters remain, the incentives remain, the underlying acceptance of corruption, of norm-breaking, of ethical flexibility in pursuit of power. That doesn't vanish with a single election cycle. It lingers. And yes, some of the policy damage can be repaired. Laws can be rewritten, regulations can be restored, courts can shift over time. But the deeper issue is cultural. It's an electorate that can look at years of indictments, impeachments, and documented abuses of office and still say, that's my candidate. Not despite those things, because they signal something. Strength, defiance, willingness to fight. That has become more valuable than integrity. And once that value system takes hold, it's incredibly difficult to reverse. Because any attempt to reintroduce ethical standards is reframed as a weakness, as surrender, as betrayal. So the cycle reinforces itself. More extreme candidates are rewarded, more conventional ones are sidelined. The baseline for acceptable conduct continues to erode, until eventually the distinction between public servant and public predator stops mattering altogether. At that point, you don't just have a political problem, you have a systemic one. Because a system that relies on good faith, on shared norms, on a basic commitment to the idea that public office is a trust, not a racket, cannot function indefinitely when one of its major parties rejects those premises. And that's the real warning embedded in all of this. Not just that the Republican Party is in a state of moral crisis, but that the crisis is being normalized, absorbed, even in some quarters celebrated. And the longer that continues, the harder it becomes to draw the line again. To say this is too far, to rebuild a political culture where that line actually means something. Because right now, for a significant portion of the system, that line has effectively disappeared. And until it's restored, the question isn't just who wins the next election. It's whether the underlying structure of American democracy can hold under the weight of a party and an electorate that no longer recognizes the difference between power and principle. This has been America's Fractured Politics. Thank you again for listening in. Until next time.